Good evening, good afternoon, good morning to all the Praktani brothers from around the globe. I welcome you all to this beautiful 68th Praktani Adda session. The idea behind organizing this Praktani Adda is to provide a platform where our brothers can share their experiences. It also provides a platform where our brothers can join and meet with each other. So without any further ado, let me call on the stage the moderator for today's Adda. The moderator for today's Adda is none other than our very own beautiful Anupam Da from 2008 batch. Anupam Da, after completing his studies at Vidyapit, went on to do BTech at IIT Kharagpur. Then he worked in the consulting industry for a few years and then again moved on to do his studies at IIT Delhi in area of policy research. Currently, Anupam Da is working as a research manager at a Dubai-based consulting research firm called Reso. Besides his work, he's also doing PhD at IIT Delhi on technology and innovation policy research. His research focuses on digital agricultural technologies and policy pathways to drive agricultural digital transition responsibly for small and medium farmers. So, Anupam Da, the stage is all yours.
Thank you, Vikas, for such a nice introduction. I have been part of, as an audience, I have been part of a lot of Praktani Adda session, and this platform has been quite instrumental in driving the session across different type of topics that includes topics on clinical genomics, topics on medical sciences, engineering, finance, data science, photography, and many others. Now, adding to this ongoing continuum, this session, I believe, is a bit distinct in the sense that through Mausam, we are charting into a new type of territory of economics and public policy research and public policy discussion. And to an extent, I must say that this session is also an extension of one of the earlier session that Satyam took, I think, last year or I think 2 years back, which was on building a career in economics or building a career pathway apart from medical or engineering. So through Mausam's journey, we can get a perspective into what a career in economics or public policy looks like, and also what does it take to build such a career or such a journey in itself. To give a brief about Mausam, so my memory about Mausam goes back to class 6 or class 7, back to Vidyapit days. For the very first instance, when I got a chance to have a look into one of his notebooks, and I was quite stunned that किसी का मतलब handwriting इतना अच्छा कैसे हो सकता है. And then after that I just had a very small conversation with myself कि ठीक है मतलब handwriting अच्छा है but असली चीज तो content होता है, handwriting का क्या ही है ये बोल के. But then after few days again, somehow I got a hang of one of his notebooks. So वो उसका English का था. And then that day I started reading क्या लिखा है, and then it was a double shock to me that not just कि handwriting अच्छा है, the content itself is a master class. So Mausam has been very good in writing and in content and everything from the very beginning, and that we have seen. He has been a great athlete during the Vidyapit days, and I'm sure even beyond that, he has been a remarkable football player, a cricket all-rounder. And then we were in the same dham, Matri Dham, in class 6. When I think Mausam was the first person जिसका मैंने वो complaint register लिखाते हुए देखा था. So, and then again we were in the same dham in class 10, Ram Krishnanand Dham, and Mausam used to be the dham sevak. This has been the journey. Many of us went to Kota for JEE preparation, and Mausam was no exception to that. But when we go to Kota, and after some time, there is a sense of realization that my life choices or anything like the career that I am trying to build may go beyond the typical physics, chemistry, biology, and engineering. But still, even with this understanding, we keep on continuing our preparation. But I will say that Mausam was quite bold enough to understand this and decided very early in the quota that no, this is not the right line of path that I'm choosing. And then he decided that he will pursue his bachelor's from Delhi University. He went on to do his bachelor's from Delhi University and then master's from Tata Institute of Social Sciences. And then after that, he did his PhD from IIT Bombay in industrial policy. I think I will be one of those selected few people who got a chance to read his PhD draft, PhD thesis, and that gives a very good understanding of the political economy of industrial policy in India. And it's quite an important work for India, I must say. Uh, After doing his PhD, now he has started working. I think during the PhD only he has started working with the Economic Advisory Council to Prime Minister of India. And in those days, his articles used to come in the Mint and also in EPW on role of institution for and what an institution can do for a country's policy making, and quite informative article as such. And then from there he has moved to do postdoc to Harvard Kennedy School, where he has worked with Danny Roderick. I must say that just to give a brief, Danny Roderick is one of a very important and credible voice in industrial policy research across the globe. And from there he has moved now to Boston University. I came to know that recently he had also started working on some sort of empirical research from the Bihar, like the industrial policy in Bihar. So what I believe is that from this presentation, we not only are going to get to a hang of what industrial policy 101 look like, but also we will also get to see that what type of theories are needed to understand industrial policy. And finally, the type of question that we keep on discussing, like why Bihar, despite having a background of Mauryan era of golden age, why it has not been able to do very well from the industrialization point of view. So Mausam's understanding may help us on answering these type of question as well. So without taking much time, I would like to welcome Mausam with this background, and he will take you through his journey as well as a basic understanding of industrial policy.
Yeah, thank you so much, Anupam. That was very, very enlightening, to be honest. Like it took me all the way back to my Vidyapeeth days, and yeah, we did share a dham. And yeah, just being able to be here, just to have this opportunity and the invite to talk about industrial policy is something which I really look forward to. And I hope it's worth your time to be on this and, maybe, learn something. I will try and make it very, very palatable for people who are very, very new in terms of starting about industrial policy. So there will be very less jargons, which I'm used to when I talk in other spaces. So thank you so much, and also to the committee, especially Ritesta, for giving me this opportunity. I know it's very hard to do this, especially across time zones and places. So just being able to be here and talk about industrial policy is great. I'm gonna share my slides now, okay? Are you able to see the slides?
Yeah, Bhaiya, it's visible.
Yeah. Okay, great. Yeah, thank you. So it's mostly about a very preliminary way to understand industrial policy and how we can, kind of think about it, because it's something which has been in vogue for a while now, and a lot of people are talking about like doing industrial policy. But what does that mean? What does this term mean in terms of an epistemic rationale of doing industrial policy? That is something which I will be talking about in this Adda. Um, so I'll briefly give you an outline in terms of what the presentation is going to look like, which is this. So the first thing which I'll point out is what is industrial policy, in the sense that, what does it mean to think about industrial policy? And when that term comes up, how do you kind of, frame it in your brain that, this is something which can be thought of as industrial policy? So that's the first basic idea. The second is to trace some of the ideas of industrial policy right all the way back to 1791. And I just want to give this so that you can get a sense where to get started. Like, who were the first early movers to think about industrial policy and how that took shape over a period of time. And then I'll give you some frameworks to think about industrial policy in terms of coherent analysis as to what does that mean. And then I'll give you some examples of contemporary industrial policies, and specifically I'll move to Bihar. And there's a lot of people in the room sort of grew up in Bihar, and that's something which is we are all interested in how Bihar can actually become the state that it is. And I think there's something which is in terms of momentum building up over the last few years, and we should probably understand what's going on. And uh, and then I'll kind of finish up with a beginner's reading list for industrial policy, so that if you have never thought about it, and where you can get started and what is the literature on that. So this is broadly the kind of framework which I'll be going about. If you have questions in the middle, you can put in the chat, and probably Anupam can take it forward later. So yeah, this is what I'll be talking about. So what is industrial policy? Over the last few years, industrial policy has sort of become a buzzword in the sense that you see it more than anywhere else. Just a very, very small chart you can see here. This is from Juhas et al. They actually deploy global trade LS data to kind of map industrial policies across the world. And if you just see the numbers, they are just crazy kind of till about 2018, you see there's very little momentum, and there's enough momentum, of course, because states are always doing industrial policy. But you can see there's a huge outlier after that period to kind of conceptualize and think about industrial policy. So yeah, I mean, this is what kind of motivates everybody to think about industrial policy and how we can go about that. Um, so so there can be a bunch of definitions on industrial policy, but the best, which in my opinion is from Juhaslin and Roderick in 2023, where they define industrial policies as those government policies that explicitly target the transformation of the structure of economic activity in pursuit of some public goal. The goal is typically to stimulate innovation, productivity, and economic growth, but it could also be about promoting climate transition, good jobs, lagging regions, exports, or import substitution. So this is a definitional sort of understanding of where the state has to intervene, and there are particular arenas where the state by itself has a stake in doing that. So this can be a good guiding light to think about industrial policy. Okay. Yeah. So what it essentially tells you is that the state by itself has a role in facilitating/shaping economic activity. And why is that really important? Essentially, industrial policies target specific structural and institutional constraints in achieving these goals. Economies are not very similar. If you compare India to US or an African economy, you will realize that they have very, very unique structural and institutional constraints, and that means the deployment of policies has to be shaped around those constraints. So what does that mean, and how we can think about addressing those constraints is something which is central to conceptualizing industrial policy. Structural constraints pertain to weak coordination between factors of production, weak backward and forward linkages upstream and downstream of supply chains, low levels and poor quality of infrastructure, which lead to high transaction costs and turnaround costs. I mean, you can see that, like, if you want to do industrial policy in a place like Bihar, for instance, you need roads, right? But if you don't have roads, then there's very, very little incentive for firms to come in. So how do you create an environment where these bottlenecks can be addressed in terms of structural constraints, in terms of inability to do business? That's something which is very, very important. How firms can be provided hand holding, that is important. The second kind of constraint can be institutional constraints in terms of weak institutions, low state capacity, and rent-seeking issues, etc., which is your state is not capable enough. Like, if you go to a state like Bihar, for instance, you may worry about corruption or rent-seeking, and that's something which is not a good thing for firms to come in, right? So how do you address these broad ideas, and how do you kind of constrain that is something which is very, very important. So if you look at this, you can understand what industrial policy is trying to achieve, which is to address these constraints. And if you do it well, then you can have a successful industrial policy. Yeah. So this is from Justin Higgs' book. This is briefly a kind of a broad policy space for the state. And you can see here there's a macro policy, there's business support, trade policy, research and innovation policy, education and training policy. There's a bunch of policies which can be thought of. All of these are not essentially industrial policies, but I want you to think of the policy space which the state has when it comes to intervening in the economy. And this is broadly where the state kind of thinks about intervening particular structural and institutional constraints we just pointed out. Okay, so once we have this broad sense of what industrial policy essentially is, we can try and go back a bit in the history of industrial policy and where the first people were in terms of thinking about industrial policy. Of all places, actually, a coherent idea of industrial policy emerged in USA. When so Alexander Hamilton was the first Treasury Secretary under George Washington. And he was appointed to kind of think of a trajectory for economy to actually like an economic trajectory for the recently independent US, right? And you can see that he came up with this list of 17 sectors which can actually be like, incentivized to do particular arenas of economic activity. And you can see that there's very weird, if you think of from a very contemporary perspective, there's like of skins, of iron, of wood, of flax. So you can see the sense that, what was important in terms of manufacturing at that point in time. Of course, he faced a lot of pressures from people like Thomas Jefferson, who kind of believed in an agrarian way of life. And then, so the tension at that point in time was about how this would kind of destroy the agrarian libertarian ways of life. And now we kind of face pressures from the state, from places like IMF and the World Bank saying that we are distorting, prices because industrial policies are being deployed. So this is the first time a coherent idea of industrial policy sort of emerges. And then the second coherent thing would be the Meiji Restoration in Japan in 1868. This is fascinating. You should just go to Google and just Google Meiji Restoration, and you'll find that. So it's a period essentially from 1868 till about 1912, where Japan sort of transforms into an economy which is kind of fighting against Western imperialism. They also get away from this idea of how samurais were actually feudals, and so they transform from a feudal system to a nation state, and they do it very coherently with a set of government policies. The Emperor Meiji was actually 15 years old when he took up the throne. So you will realize that it was not the emperor itself, but the number of people around him in terms of government, and that's where we also think of cabinets and stuff. Those kind of ideas sort of emerged from that place. So they were more from a defense modernization strategy because they wanted to have a response to Western imperialism and how that was sort of, not conducive for Japan to grow. And so they focus on infrastructure projects. They focus on technology transfers not really transfers by stealth. There is actually evidence where they bring up some artillery and make sure that they can actually turn it upside down and make their own, which is better than the one they actually got. So they prioritize particular sectors like textiles and shipbuilding. If you can see the numbers, I'm just giving you some numbers on production and exports of silk. Just look at 1868 and just look at 1914. Like it's about 12 times of what it was in that period. Similarly, if you look at the number of steamships, like this, what a clear outlier you can have there. So look at the example of length of train track. So when you see this, you will realize that a lot of states, I mean, can actually learn from the Meiji experience as to how they can particularly intervene towards specific economic and political goals, and that can be reached through a coherent set of industrial policies over that period of time. More contemporary, not really more, but in the sense that after post-war political economy, you will realize that Japan, Korea, and Taiwan are the three developmental states which have been very coherently studied by a number of scholars. There's a huge amount of literature on developmental states. I'd also encourage you to kind of go and think about developmental states and how they have actually grown up. What is a developmental state? One of the things is about intervening. So the roots of the developmental state can be traced all the way back to Meiji Restoration, in the sense that they kind of give you a framework. But in terms of a conceptualization, if you think of particular attributes of a developmental state, you can find these. So first is Ivas 1995, where he argues about a capable bureaucracy which is embedded with the non-state actors, yet autonomous in its decision making. Having a bureaucracy which can actually embed itself with non-state actors but also remain autonomous is somehow central to doing industrial policy right. It's essentially because the bureaucrats are at the center of how industrial policy interventions actually go on the ground, right? So unless they are embedded but still autonomous, they cannot really achieve those goals. And then we worry about rent seeking and corruption. So that's one thing which is very, very important. The second is a political leadership with an orientation towards development. This is something which is kind of a normative category, of course, but understanding what is at stake and how can governments think about doing industrial policy, that has to come from the political leadership at the very top, and they need to have a vision. And so having that is kind of central to doing industrial policy right. A close, often mutually beneficial symbiotic relationship between some state agencies and key industrial capitalists. Okay, yeah. This is about the picking winners sort of argument, which comes up in industrial policy, that you need to find firms which you think they can do what you're expecting over the long run, whatever your vision is. So sometimes there's a tendency to pick winners that can of course go wrong as well. You can pick the wrong winners, you can pick losers as well. But the ability to foresee that and how particular firms can actually add value, that's something which is also important. And then industrial policies form a key part of this whole policy gamut. So this is kind of, so I kind of gave you understanding from the US in 1791 till about very, very contemporary Japan, Korea, and Taiwan story. And industrial policy has to learn from these experiences, and they have been able to give you a framework of thinking about industrial policy. I'll of course point out what are the constraints in this. If you think of these countries, they're not democratic countries per se. They have a very, I mean, if you think of India, for instance, in a similar period where my PhD is kind of situated, um, India was not really able to do what these countries were able to do, and there's a bunch of reasons for why. It's also the democratic pressures, which do not really allow you to have the same kind of interventionism. So, doing economic policy making in democracy has its own challenges. That's something which I'm not taking up here, but I want you to understand how that really functions in those constraints. Okay, so once we have the sense of what is industrial policy, where does it come from, and what does it really want to achieve, I want to give you some concrete literature frameworks to think about industrial policy. Um, so this is something which I mean, I did not want to use a lot of charts in this presentation because I wanted you to have it very, lucid in that way. But yeah, this will make a lot of sense. Which is, so Peter Evans is like one of the most seminal contributors to the debate on industrial policy, and he has this concept of embedded autonomy, which I just pointed out, which is like you embed itself with the non-state actors, but also remain autonomous. And that's very hard. Like, it's a theoretical framework, but you need to find a way to understand and bring that out. So if you can see this very, very easy matrix, you can see that, if you have high embeddedness and high autonomy, then you can have a developmental entrepreneurial state. If you don't have it, if the embeddedness is low and autonomy is low, you have a predatory state where this essentially rent-seeking. But if the autonomy is high and embeddedness is low, then you have a Weberian regulatory state, which is just very, very oriented towards regulation, but not about facilitating. So it's not simply about regulating the businesses, but also making sure that they can do their thing. Because eventually it talks about industrial policy is about letting markets take shape, and how that happens is something which would decide that. Similarly, you can also think of a clientelist state where the embeddedness is high, but the autonomy is low. So I mean, the essential goal here is to go to the developmental entrepreneurial model where you can have high embeddedness and we can also have high autonomy. Um, okay. Okay, so in terms of understanding how we can achieve embedded autonomy, the state by itself has particular roles. This may be more important in late development when markets are taking shape, and some of these roles may have to evolve over time. But this would give you a very good sense of there's four key roles which the state has to do, which is the role of a custodian, the role of a demiurge, the role of midwifing, and the role of husbandry. Which is, a custodian is essentially someone who is where the state acts as a party in control when it comes to the vision of industrial policy and its actual execution. So it's essentially like the moral authority, the regulatory framework being built up as a custodian to make sure that the rules of game are in play. Like, everybody plays by the same rules, and make sure that, firms have an incentive to understand that there's going to be policy autonomy, there's going to be policy continuity. And so that's the role of a custodian. For the role of the demiurge, the state also does it by itself, especially in late development, when you have certain constraints in terms of how particular infrastructure projects have to be taken care of. The public sector has to come in terms of PSUs, which you can think of India in late development. And so the state does it by itself, kind of shows the light as to particular areas which are very high risk taking, and firms sort of are not very, very poised to do that. The third is the role of a midwife, which is essentially the word which it means, where the state takes the role of facilitating the entrepreneurial spirit and helping firms grow and providing them with the necessary protection to achieve their potential. This is midwifing, when a firm is growing up, firm is being actually given birth, you need to make sure that you have that incentive for firms to really grow, right? Just take birth, and taking birth of firms means that that midwifing role has to take in. And then you have the role of husbandry, which is the next step, where once a firm is in place, you can really give them the preconditions to actually grow. It's like grooming them and becoming the behemoths that you want in terms of particular sectors. So these are the four key roles which Evans kind of lays out to think about how the state can actually think about industrial policy and achieve the necessary embedded autonomy. Um, if I'm running out of time, please just let me know, that would be fine as well. I don't know, I'm not keeping track of time, so that would be good, okay? Um, and the second framework here is the reciprocal control mechanisms, which Alice Amsden talks about. Reciprocal control mechanisms are something which is, I mean, in common parlance, you can think of them as conditionalities, ex ante or ex post. I mean, a lot of people have theorized offshoots of RCMs, but I think, this is a framework which is very, very important if you want to think about industrial policy and how they can be deployed. Um, so what is a reciprocal control mechanism? A control mechanism involves a sensor to detect the givens in the process to be controlled, an assessor to compare what is happening with what should happen, an effector to change behavior, and a communications network to transfer information between all functions. I mean, RCMs probably give you a sense as to what needs to be done. So their idea that you have to sense what is wrong, and if something is wrong, how to fix that, and how a chain of communication can be facilitated between actors to do that. This is kind of central to policy institutionalizing in arenas of low state capacity or the constraints that they face in that period. So one thing, something in addition to reciprocal control mechanisms would be, in addition to embedded autonomy, would be to think about reciprocal control mechanisms where the states can deploy that. So eventually, with the goal of achieving embedded autonomy, you have to institutionalize the givens, the sensor, the effector, and the network, which would be, inherently embedded in the system to ensure that those goals can be reached. From a very contemporary perspective, I would say that you should pick up this book from Mariana Mazzucato called The Entrepreneurial State, and she talks about very coherent ideas about how the state is always taking the risk, in the sense that the R&D facilities or particular arenas where the firms cannot come in because of not being able to deploy that kind of finance, the state kind of sort of pitches in. So a lot of entrepreneurship actually comes from the state, and what that really means is that unless the state comes in and does the risk taking for a lot of other avenues, it's very hard for private entrepreneurship by itself to do it. So she gives very concrete examples of how the technology in iPhones, for instance, have been funded in R&D by public finance. And she has these ideas about state as a venture capitalist, and how it's very, very important for the state to do the de-risking, in a sense that, de-risking is a very, very common word now, but if you want to think of it, it's like the state has to take the lead and make sure that, that public finance is being used. And that's also kind of gives a moral imperative for industrial policy, because the state has a way to intervene in the economy through industrial policies, right? So embedded autonomy, reciprocal control mechanisms, entrepreneurial state. I mean, there's a bunch of other ideas about how industrial policy can be thought of, but if you want to get started on industrial policy, you can just think of these terms, right? So what I'm going to do briefly is going to lay out some current examples of industrial policy and what's really going on. I'll try and map a few big industrial policies very briefly. Of course, I'm not going to go really deep because I want to talk about industrial policy in Bihar at length. So I'll just give you some examples of so we are in a moment after the pandemic, right? Like I showed you a graph at the very start, which shows the number of industrial policies growing very, very in terms of an outlier. And that's happening because there's a suspicion in terms of how geopolitics is panning up, how supply chain constraints are panning up, and that leads to a sort of, a Mexican standoff in some ways for states to kind of do their own thing, right? And that's why you hear these ideas about the government in the US doing IRA or chips, right? Because they want to do semiconductors, they want to do their own green transitions, and that means building productive capacity in their own geographical areas, which is kind of a dealing with the threat of China, for instance. They didn't do it really well, of course. I mean, they lost the elections, right? So essentially what they're trying to do here is most countries are trying to do is to come in and do their own arenas and make sure that economic activity, industrial policy can actually function in this arena of post-pandemic political economy. This is also I mean, I just argued about this. There's an inward turn in global political economy where, so if in India, if you think of Atmanirbhar Bharat, for instance, or Make in India, these kind of slogans are essentially about how we can be resilient, and there's merit to these kind of arguments in the sense that you don't want to be dependent on other countries for supply chains. Of course, a global worldview would say that trade makes everybody better off, but that's not really the case. uh, so there's an inward turn, and countries are kind of trying to do industrial policy on their own and to make sure that, yeah, they can. So in the US context, you have the Inflation Reduction Act, and they also have the Chips and Science Act, which kind of provides a bunch of money for um, reducing government deficit and facilitating green transitions. If you look at the Chips Act, for instance, they assign so much money just to do chips in US. There's like a 25% investment tax credit for cost of manufacturing equipment and $13 billion for semiconductor research and workforce training. So you can see the corpus and the scale. And one thing which I'll come to is the difference in fiscal space for countries depending on where they are in the economy, right? Industrial policy can be practiced in US at very obscene levels simply because of their fiscal capacity. But developing countries, smaller countries don't really have that fiscal capacity. So how can they compete with something like US, right? How and India can do industrial policy at that same scale because India has other pressures as well, right? India has pressures on competing pressures on public finance in terms of education, in terms of health, in terms of infrastructure. So the fiscal space for industrial policy is very, very different for different economies. So in the European context, you have something called the Important Projects of Common European Interest. It's a kind of coordinated by the European Union, and this is to give you a sense of how different countries are doing industrial policy. And one thing which I argued here is the difference in fiscal space, right? Like the fiscal space for US and EU is so much more, and that kind of gives them a number of other incentives, which can also be perverse, in the sense that that could lead to money going to firms or incumbents who are not really in a position to do that. And that's an industrial policy problem, but also a fiscal space problem. And that leads to constraints on other countries, right? India cannot do the same thing. And that means how to kind of, locate that in the political economy is something economists, policymakers are still grappling with. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to briefly give you a summary of what is the production linked incentive scheme in India, because it is in India, has been there for a while. I've tried and studied it very coherently, and there's a couple of good things. There's issues with this as well, but I'm going to lay out what exactly the production linked incentive scheme is. So the production linked incentive scheme was launched in March 2020 with a focus on incentivizing domestic manufacturing. This was across firms. You could be a firm, you could be Apple, not registered in India, in the sense that you could be an American firm, but as long as you're producing in India, you will be eligible to get subsidies. And the goal was essentially to do manufacturing at a level that would lead to resilience in the economy. So the PLI scheme was first implemented across three sectors, which is key starting materials, active pharmaceutical ingredients, and large-scale electronics manufacturing and manufacturing of medical devices. Sorry. So you can see that this is the period after the pandemic where there's a huge focus on pharmaceuticals, but then it kind of also transitions into large-scale manufacturing, and now it has expanded to a lot of sectors, 14 sectors as a matter of fact. And that political economy is very complex. You have to understand that, this a lot of firms, a lot of businesses, a lot of sectors want to be a part of industrial policy because they have their own stake. So to decide, I mean, I'm not a huge fan of these 14 sectors, to be honest, because that kind of, you cannot build comparative advantage in 14 sectors. That's my sense. So a good idea maybe would be to focus on particular sectors, for instance, large scale electronics manufacturing, which I think there's a huge potential there. I've been tapping some Apple ecosystem work in Tamil Nadu, and I think there's a lot of progress. But there's something which you have to understand here is that what does the PLI scheme lead to? The PLI scheme should be about should it be about domestic manufacturing at a scale which is not adding value? So one of the constraints here in this architecture is that you don't really understand value addition. You could still be importing, say components from China, assembling in India, and you could still be exporting, and that would probably allow you to get subsidies. So one of the ways would be to think about PLI coherently, would be to think of how value addition can actually be decided. And that's not easy, especially in manufacturing. You have to find ways to do that. So, I mean, it's kind of a critique of the structure of the PLI scheme. But I think, yes, there's definitely some momentum building around how PLI can be used, especially in electronics, and some states can actually have productive capacity, which can lead to supply chains actually shifting. So some mapping of that would be, I mean, there's some work that I'm trying to do on that, as well as to understand which sectors can actually have comparative advantage and how we can maybe choose a particular sector from the 14. So this is the production linked incentive scheme in India at this point in time. Okay. Okay, now I come to Bihar, like in the sense that, a lot of people don't want to talk about Bihar, and Bihar has been a sort of an outlier in a bad way in terms of economic growth over the last 20, 30 years. The politics has been very, very disruptive. There's a huge amount of demobilization of economic forces towards actual transformation. So we all sort of understand the politics that goes on. And the political elites don't really have an incentive to do that, simply because we are so embedded in caste structures. And I mean, that's a very generalized way of looking at it. But what I've been trying to understand over the last few years is that there is momentum building in Bihar towards an industrial strategy which can tap into its comparative advantage. And Bihar has a lot of comparative advantage, and I'll try and point out what that strategy is over the last few years, and who are the key stakeholders, and how they're trying to approach industrial policy in a state like Bihar, where there's very low state capacity. Um, so so over the last few years, there has been a lot of progress. I actually was in Bihar last year, did some interviews with some bureaucrats, and tried to understand what they're really thinking about, and how an approach can actually emerge for Bihar to sort of, transition into an economic into an economic growth strategy. So, who are the key institutional actors in play? The first thing which you have to understand is that they have sort of revitalized Bihar Industrial Area Development Authority, which is BIDA. As a matter of fact, BIDA was set up in 1975, and it was sleeping up until like few years ago, when they decided to they actually pass some laws to make sure that they can be, used to incentivize industrial activity in the state. At the institutional level, the most important actor is Department of Industries, which is helming. So if you want to think of, I mean, this is not, of course, if you want to think of the classical literature on industrial policy, the MITI in Japan or Economic Planning Board in Korea, you will realize that they are all central agencies which actually kind of, are making sure that everything can be coordinated at the very highest level. And that's also important for industrial policy, irrespective of where you are practicing it, because you need a body which can, make sure that those structural and institutional constraints are kind of dealt with. So at the helm of, if you want to map how industrial policy functions in Bihar, a lot of it is coordinated by the Department of Industries, and then BIADA is another key body in that. This is to give you a sense of, the momentum. There's about 50,000 crores of MOUs being signed over the last few years. In December 2023, I tracked this from the website, just to give you a sense of what the momentum is around industrial policy. Um, so in this setting, what I can find, this is very preliminary, and in few years probably I'll have a paper. Now I don't know, like, how that's going to pan out, but this is a sort of a mapping of industrial policy landscape, and what I find is that there are five key elements of industrial policy in Bihar. One is this Department of Industry is the nodal agency, which is very, very important, especially in arenas of low state capacity, because you want firms to come to a particular place and say that here we want to get things done, right? And as long as you have an agency, a nodal agency like that, that's kind of the first determinant for success in industrial policy. And so Department of Industry is taking the helm is something which is very, very important, and a key part of industrial policy in Bihar as of now. The second is they're trying to do export orientation, which is like export orientation also at a domestic level. So, I mean, when I think of export, I also think of export going from Bihar to say Tamil Nadu or Gujarat, in a very intra-state sort of export orientation. So they came up with this Bihar export promotion policy, which was which is being implemented from 2024 to 2029 for a period of 5 years, where firms can actually get financial incentives to manufacture exports out of the state. And traditionally, if you look at the literature in economics, exports have been the way to grow, right? Because you can get prices right. And I mean, that's the argument. When you export, you can get prices right, and you can actually get a lot of inflows of finance, capital, and other sort of arenas in terms of learning as well. So to incentivize exports out of the state is something which is very, very important, and they're trying to do that. Um, the third is this land pooling part. If a firm wants to come to Bihar, what is the biggest constraint in doing that? First is to just get the manufacturing unit in place, and so how do you kind of create an ecosystem where firms can actually come in without having to worry about setting up a plant, right? And that's a strategy which has been deployed at very, very good levels in Tamil Nadu, for instance. You can try and learn what Tamil Nadu has been able to do with a cluster-based manufacturing approach. So Bihar is also trying to inculcate that in terms of a cluster of economic activity where firms can come in, and they have already established arenas where they can actually work, right? So BIDA has been developing critical industrial infrastructure, which includes plug and play infrastructure in our 75 industrial areas across districts in the state. That's a lot of plug and play infrastructure, that if a firm wants to come to Bihar and does not have to worry about setting it up, I think that's a huge incentive. So a lot of momentum has been building around that. These industrial areas are up to about at a very significantly low price, you can find that. And a lot of industrial areas have been established for firms to come in and make sure that they can just, I'm just giving you. So Patliputra industrial area, for instance, they have 32,000 square feet of plug and play infrastructure, which has been earmarked for IT. One thing which you have to understand here is that manufacturing by itself is not something which is simply being prioritized, right? It's across sectors. So IT would mean services, right? But they are also trying to make sure that firms which are doing services orientation can also come in and be a part of the process. So there's also a sectoral focus in Bihar's industrial policy. And generally, when you do industrial policy, you have to pick sectors or firms. Picking sectors is a good strategy, because then a lot of firms in that sector can actually build comparative advantage by just coming in, agglomeration effects and stuff like that. So if you think of the sectoral focus, there are three key sectors which are being prioritized in Bihar, which is textiles and leather, IT services, and food processing. These are the three sectors which are building in terms of being coherently provided incentives by the state to do their own activity, and that is about building manufacturing clusters. Sectoral focus is often a hallmark of industrial policy, but it remains to be seen how it will pan out in the medium and the long run. Yeah, and finally, there's a focus on facilitating the emergence of small and medium enterprises, which is we often talk about industrial policy when we think of these picking winners argument. We realize that they're large firms, and that may lead to productive capacity, but that may not lead to a lot of smaller firms taking advantage of that kind of an incentive. So keeping MSMEs in the picture is something which is also very important to do industrial policy right, for a lot of other reasons as well, right? So Bihar is small entrepreneurship scheme where individuals are eligible for an assistance of up to 2 lakh rupees, contingent on their family income being less than 6,000. I mean, this is literally about giving money to smaller individuals or even firms, which can actually just deploy some of state capacity in terms of, getting money or just buying into this whole ecosystem to do economic activity is something which I think, I mean, this is all, you have to understand that this is all being built up. This is not something which has already been set up, and we are trying to, so it's very hard to study their effects right now. And that's why, I mean, in like 5 years, you will be able to say, did this strategy work or not? What were the issues, and how we can evaluate and maybe go beyond that. Okay, so I think this would be my submission in terms of like how I wanted to landscape industrial policy for you. And I think so what are the challenges for Bihar to actually do industrial policy, And if you look at this landscape, and would a change in political, elites lead to a change in political policy continuity, in the sense that if a different party comes in power, would they have the same policy continuity? And that's something very important, right? Irrespective of political mobilization or political outcomes, there should be a strategy which allows for policy continuity for firms to be in shape. So it's very important to have that. So one of the constraints in doing that would be, if the incumbents don't come to power, what would happen? And if the incumbents don't come in, is the new government going to make sure that that policy continuity keeps on? I mean, my sense is that that would happen because a lot of other stakeholders are in play, but that's a challenge which has to be navigated. The other is about generating positive spillovers. So essentially, when you start with industrial policy in particular arenas, how do you scale it up in terms of providing for preconditions for that to take shape in other arenas, right? So how do you generate spillovers from that kind of an agglomeration effect is something which would be a challenge going forward, which is also about incentivizing further scaling. And the second, one of the more key important points would be to think of how we can reduce negative spillovers, right? The comparative advantage for Bihar is about having low wages, having a lot of infrastructural support, which is being built up right now. So that would lead to environmental degradation, maybe wage stagnation, ability for labor to have their own say. So these are some of the I'm trying to flag out some of the key issues which have to be pointed out to understand and how we can do industrial policy. Comparative advantage of Bihar lies in its readily available workforce, which can be trained to participate in industrial activity at much lower labor costs than some of the other more industrialized states in the country. So this is actually the advantage, and one of the themes which sort of came out in my interviews with bureaucrats in Bihar is that a lot of firms are looking to ensure that they can tap into this, and that also means there's a mobilization for labor to not move out. I mean, one of the things which we all understand is how the migrant workforce from Bihar has been a sort of a driver of economic transition in a lot of other states, right? So why not that can be deployed in Bihar? And there's a coherent strategy from the state and from the firms to kind of think around that, which is something will lead to that. Um, and then, eventually, like, I'll come to this whole point of how a bureaucratic setup will make sure that rent seeking is reduced, right? In a state like Bihar, where, I mean, anecdotally, you struggle with corruption a lot, right? I mean, that could be true everywhere else, but that's something which has to be curtailed in terms of allowing for firms to make sure. And the fact that the Department of Industry is at the center of doing this would lead to a lot of reduction in that. So these are some of the challenges which I just thought of in terms of flagging for Bihar to kind of do industrial policy right. And there's a huge amount of work that can be thought of from the Tamil Nadu perspective as to how you can deploy a strategy from Tamil Nadu's, understanding. I mean, I don't want to talk about Tamil Nadu because I have some work on Tamil Nadu as well going on as well. So Tamil Nadu is a state which other states can actually learn from. You don't have to go to Japan and Korea and Taiwan to think about industrial policy. As a matter of fact, Tamil Nadu state is a state which has been doing it very, very well, especially with the infrastructure and the cluster-based manufacturing they have been able to build. Okay, this is something which I was thinking of in terms of giving you a sense, and I hope it was probably able to I was probably able to give you a sense of how to think about industrial policy, even as a starter or somebody who's wants to go deep into these kind of issues. Um, these are some of the literature ideas on thinking about how to do industrial policy, how to think about industrial policy. These are some of the books you reach out to me and ask me, like, I can share a copy on email as well if you feel like. Um, if you have more questions, I'm here. Okay, thank you so much. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Mausam. So you have summarized very well in very short stint of time. So we will start taking some questions. So we have one of the question from Satyam, that how well can Bihar compete with other states in attracting industries? Southern and western states are far ahead, consistently drawing significant investment, and even among northern and eastern states known for cheap labor, UP, Uttar Pradesh has made quite a notable progress. So this makes it a particularly challenging time for Bihar to attract investment given the intense competition between the states. So if you can put some light on this.
Oh yeah, no, that's a great question. See, India is at a stage where a lot of states are still catching up. We may be in 2024, but if you look at economic activity in terms
Mhm.
of the potential comparative advantage and in terms of how states are placed, there's a lot of potential for even competition at that level for firms to come in. Um, one thing which I'd argue for Bihar, what works for Bihar is a workforce which can actually be trained very, very fast. And there's a lot of evidence of that. I mean, at least not, I've not been able to establish that empirically, but a lot of workforce in Bihar are very, very open to working and being trained to work in particular sectors, especially textiles and leather, for instance. And the comparative advantage is also low cost infrastructure, which is being provided by the state. So it's not a zero sum game in the sense that somebody does not have to lose if UP has to win. Both the states can actually make sure that they can actually do industrial policy and benefit from this whole architecture of state incentivizing and providing for markets to take shape. So I don't think it's like a direct competition. States can have their own suites of policies and they can be deployed irrespective of how much competition that is happening at that level. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Mm,
So one thing that also comes to my mind, so often we see that even the finance minister Nirmala Sitaraman in one of her speech had mentioned is that one of the very old policy or industrial policy of India that's called the freight equalization policy, and in some of the interviews she talks about it that this policy has done some injustice to eastern India. So if you can put some understanding from your perspective there, what it is and how it has done.
Yeah, I mean, historically, I think, if you want to understand the trajectory of India and especially the states, a lot of policy making has not been very coherently thought of, especially in the belt that you are arguing about. So it's kind of embedded in the politics of that point in time. So unless you understand the politics in terms of who were the incumbents and how the government at the center sort of mobilized that, and what was the
Mhm.
incentive for the state to actually pick up states, and of course freight equalization was something which really, really hampered how it would happen in other arenas compared to, say, Tamil Nadu or in the South. So in terms of understanding the historical roots of why particular states have been laggards, there is something which is at the state level, but there's also something at the state central level, right? In the
Yeah.
sense that you have to find ways, irrespective of that state, to provide preconditions for economic activity, for economic mobilization to happen. And that, of course, did not happen in a lot of states in India.
Okay. Yeah. Right. Right. So, if anybody have any other question,
but
maybe.
yeah,
Yeah, we can.
I have one question. Like you explained about how like change in the government machinery can help bring the transformation in Bihar. But yeah, what about the cultural shift? Like the still the mindset in Bihar is that they want government jobs. They don't want to take up entrepreneurship or like starting a business. Like still there is that like the culture is a kind of that. So how can like these policies help like transform that, or that has to be done differently?
No, 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 absolutely. I agree on that cultural. I mean, that's kind of an India thing. It's not a Bihar thing, to be honest. It's also about the. I mean, it's very hard to pin down cultural arguments about how states don't really grow, right? I mean, we have to think more coherently about that. Why Bihar cannot be a state which does economic activity compared to, say, Gujarat. Like, of course, there are cultural roots to it, right? But as a state, I think we need to think beyond that. There will be enough incumbents, in my sense, who will make sure that they can come into these arenas irrespective of these cultural issues. Like, there will be enough entrepreneurs. If they get facilitated, they will find ways. I mean, I mean, a large number of people in Bihar are like, would like to do a government job. It's simply because they're happy to do a 30K, 40K job because that gives them security, and that means they have low risk appetite, right? But there would be enough people in terms of entrepreneurs who will take advantage if a particular business is set up or a particular ecosystem is being built. So that's not my huge concern, in the sense that, but as long as the state does its job, as long as the state provides for the economic preconditions for economic activity to emerge, I think, Bihar will be fine. Yeah, that's my hope and sense.
Because if we don't change those like do those cultural shift, then people from outside the state will come and start a
No,
industry or start a factory. So
no, that's okay. Like, that's not a concern for me. Like, if a Gujarati entrepreneur comes to Bihar and sets up a plant, I'm not, that does not concern me in the sense that, it would be very hard to sort of, kind of ask for people in Bihar and everybody else around the whole ecosystem to kind of become entrepreneurs overnight, right? So you have to think of, I mean, if you want to think of India, right, FDI comes out of the country, right? So there would be a lot of other preconditions, irrespective of how Bihari entrepreneurs would have to emerge, right? I mean, ideally I would want Bihari entrepreneurs to emerge, but I'm not hung up on that idea. Like, there are too many variables there. So in terms of how a particular area can have their own entrepreneur, that's like a domestic idea of entrepreneurship, which is not very, very easy to sort of, conceptualize. So as long as economic activity happens, as long as firms come in, irrespective of where they are based out of, what are the cultural roots, I think that's more important. Yeah.
Uh, I have another question there. We
Sure.
see that the corruption is quite ingrained in the government machinery in India. So it is not about industrial policy, but how the policy the politicians are also the lawmakers. So how can the public policy help overcome that corruption?
Yeah, you're putting me in a tricky spot. I don't think this is a place because it will go on YouTube, so I cannot be very candid. But yeah, I mean, essentially, you have to understand that. I mean, there's a lot of work on this, to be honest. Like, if you look at people like Wen Yang, she talks about how corruption is not a huge thing. Like, corruption happens everywhere. Like, corruption would happen on Wall Street or in US or a lot of other government contracts. It would happen anywhere. Corruption has to be dealt with. There's like, you cannot say that, it's something which we can just, run about. Corruption is kind of intrinsic to the system, but you have to make sure that there is economic capacity being built as a result of that as well. I mean, I don't know like how to deal with that, especially when political elites are entrenched in that. I mean, I don't have, as an academic, as a researcher, I really do not have insights on how political elites, they have to have their own morality, in the sense that, I mean, if you look at the way transformations have happened, political elites have taken the first step. So unless there's a sort of, moral imperative from the political elites to do the right things, it would be a very difficult situation. And I understand what you're trying to point out. How do you, so one way would be to have pressures from the electorate, in the sense that if you find that, your political elites are corrupt, you vote them out, right? But in India, that does not happen. That does not happen for a variety of reasons. So yeah, I mean, there are so many threads to that. I mean, it's kind of, very hard to pinpoint as to what would lead to that not happening. That is the incumbents feeding off, especially incumbent firms, feeding off political elites, is something which is a story in India, of course. So yeah, I mean, I cannot think that I can give you an answer on that, but yeah, we need to think more about that.
But yeah, one last question, are pilot projects being used in industrial policy? Like, do we do pilot projects first and then implement it on a larger scale for
Yeah, so so
industrial
so
policies?
Yeah, so this is a very, so one of some of the pushback which we get, the pushback which economists have for industrial policy is that, it's very hard to say that industrial policy leads to this, right? If you go to the RCT ecosystem, the economists would run a pilot or like an RCT and say that, say if you give money to a family, 10% of that goes to health, or like, there's a possibility for that to be attributed to particular outcomes happening. And that's where the RCT sort of come in, they can pinpoint and say that this led to a particular outcome. If you give more money to a school, they deploy a particular, in particular arenas, and that led to educational outcomes increasing, right? So one of the pushback against the whole industrial policy literature has been that, hey, it's very hard to say that this led to industrial policy, unless you really want to think about how attribute causality. It's very hard to attribute causality to industrial policy. And that's something which is why economists are very, very skeptical about industrial policy. If you look at IMF and the World Bank, their approach to industrial policy is very, very acerbic, very they're very negative about industrial policy simply because they think of it as market distorting. Like, if you provide incentives to firms through industrial policies, they're distorting the market price of that in that economy. So it's very hard to say that, industrial policy would lead to this, but that's also something which is an economist fad with doing RCT sort of work. I mean, I'm not a huge fan of RCTs. I don't think they give you a lot of insights unless, I mean, it's very hard to say that an RCT which worked in Tamil Nadu will work in Bihar as well, right? So there's a lot of other variables. So unless you really kind of broaden your horizon and think about other arenas, then industrial policy would not make sense to you. So yeah, I mean that kind of pilot work is not very very conducive to industrial policy unless you go very very micro, which is not possible because incentives come from the state. There are so many incumbents. You have to find and make sure that you can pick winners and have a strategy which would actually work out in the long run. So yeah, I mean RCT work is not something which is done in municipal policy a lot. One of the ways to do that, I mean, I'm just thinking on my head, like one of the ways to do that would be to say you pick up particular firms, you give them money and see how they use that for R&D, for instance. Like I give you, if you are a firm, you come to me, I'm the government, I give you money and you deploy that to say, I ask you to do R&D, right? That money is contingent on doing R&D. In that case, it would be possible for me to attribute how much of that money really went to R&D capacity building, right? So yeah, we can think of those pilots, but that cannot be at the very highest scale. That's something which is my sense. Yeah.
Like the one Jepal is doing, like they do
Yeah.
pilot.
JPAL are more like, more health education, they have their own thing. They do their own thing. We are not like, I mean, that's a good organization. Of course, they want to study policy at a very empirical level. And there's, of course, a lot of merit in doing industrial policy on that scale, on that vantage. A lot of people would argue that, but it's very hard to do it. Like, industrial policies come with a lag in the sense that, if you think of PLI being implemented now, it would take, in my sense, it would be very hard for anybody who understands it to say that it's working or not. I mean, as an economist, as somebody who's trained in public policy, I would not be able to say it's working or not. A politician may say it, somebody who's not in a space can say that, but I don't think it's very, very easy to attribute industrial policy success in the very short run. It takes a while, like, there's a lag to it. And that's a policy constraint which has to be navigated when you think of industrial policy. Yeah.
Yes, I think this is one of the major critique of industrial policy, which what they call the information critique, like that you cannot actually know that what government can do and what are the different sectors that government should support on. Like as you said, as you mentioned earlier, that from three different sectors, the production linked scheme moved to 14 sectors. So what was the logic behind moving to 3 to 14? So there cannot be any empirical backing to that, right? So
Yeah, I mean, I think I kind of pointed out my suspicion with that as well,
mm,
which is,
mm,
see, when policy making happens in these arenas, there are a lot of people who want to be a part of the whole process, right? Firms
yes,
across
right.
sectors will say, hey, we can do this as well. But it's not for the firms to decide as to how that really happens. It's for the state to decide it. So the
Mm-hmm.
moral imperative on choosing particular sectors, the moral and the policy imperative for choosing sectors has to be embedded in the rationale as to if that sector can lead to comparative advantage. Like if any sector say, I am making electronics, like, I go to the state and say, hey, we need subsidies and we could be a part of PLI and we can do it well. But then the actual bureaucratic setup, the governmental organization in terms of how they think of industrial policy has to evaluate that, right? Like, is there potential for comparative advantage to be built in that sector? So my suspicion is that you should not be doing so many sectors at the same level unless you have been able to have good spillover effects, unless you have been able to generate enough evidence to say that this sector has actually been doing well and maybe we can replicate that, right? So some of the work which I've been trying to do is to understand the PLI scheme from the Apple iPhone ecosystem. The study of PLI scheme should not be about how many iPhones are being made in the country, but what is the amount of supply chain that is being emerging in the country, which is becoming supplier to the Apple ecosystem, right? So unless you understand that that spillover has been generated, it's very hard to do scaling that up. And I think, this idea of scaling it into so many sectors is something which has to be thought of very coherently.
Okay, so I think we are well beyond time as well, and we can close this. But before we close, I think this is going to be uploaded on the YouTube, and lots of people are going to watch it. So a final question for you, Mausam, is like if someone wants to build a career in public policy or sort of like economics and public policy research, what type of pathway you may suggest? Where should he start, and all those things? Yeah,
So yeah, I mean, as you pointed out, I'm sort of an accidental, public policy guy because I wanted to be an engineer like every Bihari, right? So,
great.
so, so I mean, I just had the courage to decide that this is not something which I want in my life, and I think it's not always easy, especially from the ecosystem that we come up from. So I decided at some point that I want to do economics, public policy, whatever, so one thing would be to understand that your calling is your own, right? You need to find that and kind of understand how you can do your thing. I mean, the whole world is kind of not very conducive to let you do your own thing, right? We all understand that. So in terms of building a career, what I'd say is that you take baby steps. You take a step and then map up. Like that has been my strategy. Like I did economics at Delhi University, and then I went to a bunch of other places, and those were essentially about me just taking more time to understand what I want. And right when I was trying to do my PhD, that's where something clicked in the sense that I wanted to think very coherently about industrial policy and be a student of it. It's about reading a lot of books and trying to understand what is the landscape, how you can be a part of that. So if you want to build a career in public policy, you don't need to have a PhD. It's something which is you can do without having a PhD in public policy, which I have. But the sense is to understand how you can really map onto that, how you can really think of a particular question and understand it. A lot of people work in consultancies, which are like very, very good places to work on industrial policy. As a matter of fact, you can be in other spaces which are like think tanks and organizations in the government which do industrial policy. I, as an academic, have a very different approach, of course, but a lot of people are trying to latch onto this because there is public value to how industrial policy can be thought of, public policy in general. So simply being in academia or only being in academia is not the only way to do it. I mean, I can talk at very, very length in terms of how you can get from IIT Bombay to Harvard Kennedy School. I mean, there's a trajectory to that. It's not There's a lot of people trying to chase a very few goods, and so from an academic point of view, I can tell you that it takes a lot of time to build onto that, but there are other ways as well. If you do not have the appetite to do a PhD, right? Everybody does not have an appetite, and everybody should not have an appetite. So there are so many ways. There are a lot of ways you can work in different sectors, you can different arenas, and you can still do the same thing. And all of us can think and engage with this very currently. So if you need more advice, you can reach out to me. You have my email, and I'll be happy to give you more insights. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. It has been a great evening for us and morning for the Mausam, and I think we can close it here because you can take it from here. Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you, Mausam and Anupam for this amazing session. Uh, we all know that it takes a lot of hard work to present this kind of information and everything. I also like to thank all the audience. I, on behalf of Vidyapit Praktani and the executive committee, like to thanks all of you. For everyone's information, the next Adda is by Santanu Ruzda from 1989 batch. He will talk about his entrepreneurship journey. We will soon be sending WhatsApp messages about this next Adda detail. So thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you again, Mausam and Anupam for your hard work and giving time.
No, thank you. Thank you so
Uh,
much for the opportunity. I just want to close by saying I'm very grateful to Anupam for doing this. Anupam has been a friend from school, and I've admired him a lot. He's also a poet, as a matter of fact, if you don't know. So you should check out his poems at some point. I don't know if they're public. Yeah, I mean, this whole idea of doing this is something very, very important for a school like RK Mission. We have a huge network of alumni who do really incredible work throughout their journeys. So just to be able to do this, and honestly, I'm very grateful to Ritesh Da because he has been coordinating this for a long time and he has a lot of passion for doing this. especially the team, you, Satyam, and everybody else who's a part of the team in organizing this. I know a lot of work goes into that. So yeah, I just want to close by saying that, I really enjoyed sharing it. I hope it was informative because I did not want to. I mean, there's a lot of things that can be said about industrial policy, but I tried to package it in a way which is palatable to people who are new to this, right? So essentially that was the goal, and I hope that goal was reached. Anybody wants more information or tries to engage with it better, you can reach out to me on my email. I'll be happy to do that. Yeah.
Thank you again, Mausam. Anupamda, if you
Thank you.
like to share any poem, you can just
Uh,
you can share with
maybe some other time, of course.
sure, Dada,
Thank
sure, Dada.
thank you very
Thank you for
much.
joining us, Dada. Thank you everyone for joining us. It was a lovely evening.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, bye. Have a good day.